مساء الخير وأهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من واشنطن أونلاين. معي أنا هدي العويس على شبكة نورث بريس. رفض مجلس النواب الأمريكي بغالبية الأصوات مشروع قانون اقترح سحب القوات الأمريكية من شمال شرق سوريا، كما أصر المجلس على معاقبة أي دولة ثالثة أو أي كيان ثالث يختار التعامل مع الحكومة السورية ومع نظام دمشق. هذا ما نبحثه في حلقة اليوم من واشنطن أونلاين، وضيفي لهذه الحلقة هو الدكتور ستيفن هايدمان، رئيس مشروع اليوم التالي لسوريا في منظمة السلام الأمريكي. ابقوا معنا لمتابعة الحلقة. أهلا وسهلا بك ضيفي الدكتور ستيفن هايدمان، شكرا لوقتك وتواجدك معي اليوم. دكتور ستيفن، حالة من الإجماع الغريبة في الكونغرس الأمريكي على بعض المسلمات المتعلقة بالملف السوري، ومنها رفض الأعضاء الجمهوريين والديمقراطيين لمسألة التطبيع مع نظام الأسد. ماذا نفهم من حالة التوافق هذه بين مشرعين نادرا ما يتفقوا على أي موقف تجاه أي ملف داخلي أو خارجي؟
Well, I think the resolution that you're referring to reflected a really extraordinary degree of consensus among America's very divided politicians about resistance to normalization of the Assad regime. The vote was almost unanimous, which is something that essentially never happens in today's Washington. So I can't imagine a more powerful signal from Congress in opposition to normalization. Whether it will have any impact in how other countries make their own decisions about engaging with the Assad regime is unclear. The most effective instrument that the U.S. has to encourage governments, in particular governments in the region, not to normalize with the Assad regime is the use of sanctions, which already exist. And I'm thinking in particular of the Caesar Sanctions Act, which empowers the administration to designate third parties that deal with the Assad regime as sanctioned entities or sanctioned individuals. So what we heard from Congress, I think, was really a signal to the White House that it should make broader use of sanctions, that it should begin to apply third-party sanctions much more aggressively than it has so far. And it will be up to the White House to do so. Congress itself does not have the authority to impose those kinds of sanctions. That has to come from the White House in this case. And I think that's what we heard Congress saying to the White House is to take further steps to prevent other governments from normalizing. But it's unclear, frankly, whether the White House is listening.
بالتزامن مع بعض التحركات في الكونغرس الأمريكي تجاه الملف السوري، كان هناك زيارة هامة جدا لمارك مالي، أكبر مسؤولي وزارة الدفاع الأمريكية لشمال شرق سوريا. أي رسالة حمل معه مارك مالي، ولمن كانت الولايات المتحدة توجه رسائلها من خلال هذه الزيارة؟ هل كانت رسائل موجهة للاعبين دوليين في الملف السوري مثل أنقرة وروسيا، أم أنها رسالة لنظام الأسد ومرتبطة مع رسائل الكونغرس الرافض للتطبيع؟
I'm not so sure that Miley's visit was connected with the debate about normalization. I think what it reflected was a clear signal of the ongoing value of the very small troop presence that the U.S. has in northeast Syria. And if we think about who the potential audiences for that kind of signal are, I think we have to look to Ankara, we have to look to Moscow, to Tehran, to Damascus. But here, too, I think we have a number of politicians in the U.S. Congress and the House of Representatives who have raised questions about whether U.S. troops should remain in Syria. And I think Miley was emphasizing that there is a continued role in the anti-ISIS operations in northeast Syria, that the U.S. is assisting local partners in conducting operations that are affecting ISIS and its capacity. And he wanted to make clear, I think, to regional actors and to Russia, to Iran, that they will not be able to bring about the removal of U.S. forces as long as the U.S. views that their presence is still having a positive impact.
نعم، بحسب تقارير البنك الدولي إعادة إعمار سوريا بعد الحرب تتطلب مليارات الدولارات حتى قبل كارثة الزلزال الأخيرة. الدول العربية من الواضح أنها لا تقدم مليارات الآن لسوريا، ولم تعد سوريا بمنحها مليارات الدولارات. وأضف إلى ذلك تمسك الولايات المتحدة بعقوبات قيصر التي ستعاقب هذه الدول إذا ما أقدمت على تقديم مثل هذه المبالغ لإعادة إعمار سوريا. ما هو إذن هدف تطبيع الدول العربية؟ عن ماذا ممكن أن يثمر مثل هذا التطبيع؟
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that there has been an increase in diplomatic engagement with the Assad regime since the earthquake. But most of that engagement has come from governments that had already established some kind of relationship with the Assad regime, had moved beyond normalization, like the United Arab Emirates, like Oman, like Egypt, for example. And so we should not, I think, exaggerate the extent to which the earthquake has produced significant and lasting shifts in the pace of normalization and in how broadly the Assad regime is being welcomed back into the region. We haven't really seen very much of that. I think the purpose of these visits is to demonstrate that regional actors are concerned about the humanitarian effects of the earthquake. And what they are trying to do, as far as I can tell, is to walk a very fine line between demonstrating their support for efforts to provide humanitarian relief on the one hand, without appearing to legitimate the broader Assad regime and its status in the world, or in Syria for that matter. So we have seen delegations that have traveled to areas affected by the earthquake. What we have not seen is any kind of wider diplomatic initiative about the broader normalization of the Assad regime. And I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind.
ماذا عن آمال الدول العربية بالتخفيف من النفوذ الإيراني في سوريا؟ ماذا نعرف اليوم عن قدرات إيران في صناعة القرار السياسي داخل دمشق، وأيضا بالمقارنة مع القدرات الروسية، خاصة أن التقارير الدولية تتحدث عن أن روسيا سحبت وتسحب بعض من قواتها، بعض من فرقها المدربة بشكل جيد من الأراضي السورية لنقلها إلى الحرب في أوكرانيا.
It does seem that Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine has created additional space for Iran to maneuver in Syria. I think that's clear. Iran is moving much more aggressively to position weapons in Syria. Whether they're intended for Lebanon or for the southern Syrian border isn't clear. But it is clear that Iran is playing a more assertive, more visible, more influential role in Syria because of Russia's focus on the war in Ukraine. But I think here too we have to be very cautious about overinterpreting this. It seems to me that Iran's influence continues to bump up against certain constraints, not only on the part of Russia, which has a very different view of its role in Syria than Iran does, but also against the Assad regime itself, which has proven to be very, very willing to use its own position to try to channel and shape the extent to which Iran's influence is able to grow and expand in Syria.
دكتور ستيفن، أنت من الأشخاص الذين دعوا عبر السنوات لسياسة طويلة الأمد، سياسة متماسكة تجاه الملف السوري، وهي غير موجودة حتى الآن أمريكيا. ولكن هل ترى أن هذه التحركات في الكونغرس، الحديث المكثف عن الملف السوري بعد الزلزال، سيعيد لفت أنظار إدارة جو بايدن إلى الملف السوري، وسنرى فعلا أخيرا سياسة طويلة الأمد؟
I have to say that I'm afraid I don't think that the earthquake will bring about any kind of interest on the part of the U.S. in re-engaging on Syria diplomacy. I don't see that as very likely. It's unfortunate, but I don't see it as very likely. And I'm not sure that we will see any similar kind of shift toward greater engagement with Syria from the European Union either. it seems to me that perhaps the principal focus on which we might see greater engagement as a result of the earthquake concerns European efforts to ensure that it is not the target, or that it does not become the focus of a massive new wave of people fleeing Syria, or fleeing southern Turkey for that matter, Syrians in southern Turkey, out of earthquake affected areas. We know that there's been a massive increase in illegal immigration into the European Union from Lebanon, Syria over the last year. And I suspect that the main policy implication of the earthquake will not be on the diplomatic front in efforts to find a solution to the conflict around UN Security Council Resolution 2254, but will really be a damage control effort, unfortunately, looking mostly at how to deal with what could be a new influx of refugees.
النائب الجمهوري مات جيتس فشل في إقناع مجلس النواب الأمريكي للتصويت على قرار قد يفضي إلى سحب القوات الأمريكية من شمال شرق سوريا. كان هناك بعض الأصوات الديمقراطية من التقدميين أيدت القرار، ولكن غالبية الأعضاء في مجلس النواب أرادوا إبقاء القوات في شمال شرق سوريا. هل مسألة سحب القوات هي مسألة لها شعبية اليوم في واشنطن؟ ما طرحه مات جيتس إلى أي حد يتمتع بشعبية وتأييد من المشرعين ومن المهتمين بالشأن السوري هنا في أمريكا؟
I don't think that this is a popular move. I think Matt Gaetz is an extremist. He's an outlier in the Congress. It's true that there are some progressives who have a general stance in which they are critical of U.S. military intervention. But I think in this case, the value of the presence of U.S. forces in northeast Syria is widely appreciated, widely understood in Congress, and so I don't see this as a very serious effort. I will say, however, that in attaching this resolution to a request for war powers action by Congress, Gaetz is being very smart, because there is a sense in Congress that the White House has overstepped in its use of existing war powers resolutions. We've seen that even from some very centrist politicians like Virginia Senator Tim Kaine. And so Matt Gaetz is being strategic, he's being smart, but I still view the prospects that this bill could pass as very, very low. I don't expect anything to happen with it.
هل من الممكن أن يكون التواجد الأمريكي في شمال شرق سوريا بوابة تدخل الولايات المتحدة ليكون لها بصمة سياسية أكبر تفضي إلى حل سياسي للقضية السورية؟ أم أننا اليوم حين نتحدث عن التواجد في شمال شرق سوريا نتحدث عن مهمة أخرى، وكأننا نتحدث عن حتى دولة أخرى، دولة غير الدولة السورية؟
Well, I think we have to be careful not to indicate that the U.S. presence in northeast Syria somehow means that the U.S. does not support the idea of Syria's territorial integrity. I think it's clear that the U.S. has stated many times that it supports the territorial integrity of Syria. And I think that the U.S. presence there is having an impact on the political environment, the political landscape. Think about when President Erdogan was threatening to invade northeast Syria. And the U.S. at first halted some of the patrols it was conducting with its partners in the northeast, but then resumed those patrols and made very clear statements to Ankara that it opposed a military intervention in the northeast. Had that occurred, it would have had an enormous impact on the possibilities for a political settlement. So the U.S. presence there does give the U.S. some leverage over the pathway forward diplomatically. Unfortunately, the White House is not taking as much advantage of the leverage those forces offer the U.S. as it should. And so at the moment, I'm afraid it doesn't seem terribly likely that we will see the White House try to make better use of the leverage that it has achieved through the U.S. presence. I think that's unfortunate in my view. But I do think that just the presence of those troops on the ground does mean that there are possibilities for a settlement that remain open, which might otherwise have been shut down. For example, if Turkey had invaded northeast Syria.
نعم، شكرا جزيلا لك ضيفي الدكتور ستيفن هايدمان، كنت معنا من واشنطن.
Thank you very much, Adil.
وفي الختام شكرا لكل متابعي واشنطن أونلاين، ألقاكم في حلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل، إلى اللقاء.